what happened, guys? How did the glorious medieval kingdom of France become our modern, senseless, pagan France? First up, before we dive into this, you better know that you're listening to two trade school trads, where we dive into history but explain it from an honest perspective. This is real history, the known and the not well known.
You know, Alan, when I think of the French Revolution, it seemed to me it's one of the most romantical periods when it comes to like liberal democracies. It's the time when, you know, the people kind of rose up against their old world tyrannical governments and said, we have the authority to govern ourselves, you know. That's the time when we can just go and hit the streets and just cut off heads. Everything is great. It's just beautiful. It's just wonderful. And it's very romantical in that sense. It's like, ooh, that's where democracy and republics were born. It's wonderful.
I think there is this narrative like, you know, this is the age of freedom we enter into. There's this great age of we're throwing off all of the old tyranny and we're starting fresh. The people have power now. You see this in the American Revolution, now the French Revolution. I mean, albeit we're going to sweep all of the inconveniences under the rug. We're not going to talk about all the other things that happened in the process. But woohoo, we won. There's no more kings taxing us. We have a new elected government that's going to tax us instead, and it's all going to be better. You know?
Mm-hmm. It seems that at that point, the people wanted to have a little chunk of the pie. They wanted to govern themselves. They wanted to have a direct say in how government worked and such. And monarchy, especially in France, got in the way of that. That was the big obstacle that they had to overcome.
Throughout this episode today, we're going to be showing you the narrative as has been told to the majority of the world, and then we're going to dive into the real history, which isn't completely in the closet, but it's not talked about enough. We're going to prove to you why this revolution that we're going to talk about is so important and why something actually legitimately crazy happened, the spirit of which would grip the entire world.
So let's go over a little bit of the background. What's like the history class kind of version of history? So King Louis XVI, initially, he calls the Estates General. This is kind of the big point where he shows a little bit of weakness and says, hey, I need some advisory help. Can like all three estates come in? And you learn about the three estates. The first estate being the nobility, that's noble families, royalty, such. You have the second estate, which is the clergy, and you have the third estate being the common folk, the peasantry.
We might need to actually back up like the importance of why this is big in France. Otherwise, this might just sound like a political squabble in one country at one point in time. I want to interject here just quick. Like, France is really important on the world stage, especially at this point in time. France is regarded as the eldest daughter of the church. It was basically the figurehead of Europe culturally. It was the great think tank of the West since at least the early 17th century. It's kind of like where all the hot ideas of the times are discussed. It's kind of the trendy place to be in the 1600s and 1700s, even into the 1800s. Like, France is kind of like the battleground intellectually of all the ideas. It's the most famous country in the world. Its empire is global. I mean, granted, it just got set back, but it's also the largest bulwark of Catholicism left in Europe in 1789 when the revolution broke out. And so that's this very influential on the world stage, and especially within the Catholic circle.
Yeah, France was deeply embedded with Catholicism. Not only did the monarchy get its authority directly from Rome, it also was really the only recognized religion at the time in France. And it was really a big holdout from the Reformation as well. They tried to get a beachhead into France, but it really didn't take off. So Catholicism in France is very well aligned and really could not have changed up until this point.
Yeah, that's for sure. And it had the most famous monarchy as well. And so Catholicism just being one with France, it's also one with the monarchy. And this monarchy is very famous, most famous monarchy in the world after probably the papacy at this point in time. It dates very proudly back 800 years straight, and with very strong ties actually to Charlemagne, very famously called the father of Europe and the medieval political order. France is pivotal to the West and Europe, and that's why we're going to talk about this today.
I think we kind of agree together that there are 10 real big points that we can nail as kind of the basic facts, the kind of the main things that everybody is taught. So first, the estates are called. The Estates General, which is the three estates. They come together. King Louis XVI is trying to save the situation, kind of lower the temperature. He's saying, hey, I want your advice. What do you got for me? The third estate is not pleased. They don't think that they're getting their way, so they break away. They have the National Assembly, and through the tennis court oath, become their own thing. The violence starts to begin. We hear about angry mobs. We hear about people being called anti-revolutionaries. And after a while, the king is captured and is forced to acknowledge the power of the new government and say that they have lawful authority. The government is hijacked from there, and the legislation starts to begin. We get the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen at this time, as well as the detrimental civil constitution of the clergy. And then later on, in 1791, the king tries to flee from Paris, but is captured by the revolutionaries. And then the Reign of Terror begins. The king is trying to flee. He's against us. Now, all gas, no brakes. The king is executed, followed shortly by the queen, and then, of course, many more. And wars erupt. Austria declares war. We have the nuns of Compiègne. And then there's just political instability that continues on up until 1799 when Napoleon takes full control. So the French government, before the revolution, was showing signs of complacency. Louis XIV and the 15th really didn't seat to their responsibilities as well. They should have. There was a lot of, like I said, complacency. They didn't want to really fight to keep their finances in well.
And these guys were kings from the late 1600s, or these two kings reigned from the late 1600s all the way till the mid 1700s between these two forefathers of Louis XVI, who we're going to talk about.
Right, and then the sentiment was starting to build. They started to see a little bit of weakness in the monarchy, and the overall trust of the populace was starting to decrease. Still, religiously, France was still a Catholic country. There was no instability within the church per se, but still that complacency, that comfort was still evident.
This is kind of a testament to Catholicism. Like in the instance of these nuns of Compiègne, you see the true nature of Catholicism. You see the church at its finest. It's an emblem just like Christ, the lamb led before the slaughter, that opened not its mouth. These 11 nuns and their 5 associates, they were true brides in following their husband, our Lord, and were used as instruments of God's will to end the chaos. As just a novena's time after their martyrdom, the Reign of Terror dramatically ended. It's like Belloc says, Catholicism will wither slowly when left in peace, when left to be complacent with itself. But the moment it is touched with a hot iron or hint of persecution, it mobilizes instantly and catches fire. That was a very loose quotation of Belloc, but that's the gist he makes. And this is one of those epic moments in world history that has been sadly underemphasized and overlooked. It's actually the start of a Catholic revival in France, which you see, because the spiritual good that would come out of this revolution far surpassed the complacency that would have kept on in France, the sleepiness, the drowsiness that had full hold of France had the revolution never happened. But this sacrifice, like what the nuns gave, this is a sacrifice that we ought to look to and remember with awe and reverence down to our own day. And remember, it was said in antiquity too, and it still holds true. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. But anyways, to get off my soapbox, there's something very interesting at work here. You have this sleepy church, something happens, and then bang.
Yeah. So really, the history part of it that we're all kind of taught is that the French king was a tyrant. He taxed everybody. It was inconsistent, and it was overdone. Nobody else paid taxes except the Third Estate, and they just partied and blew money like it was nothing.
Yep. That's exactly how it went, right, Jack?
Yeah, sure. And then, of course, famine hit. And, of course, that was the king's fault and nobody else's. And Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake. They can't eat bread. Let them have some cake.
So this is the very famous history line, it's used. I mean, I think a lot of people have figured out by this time, but yes, that is not true. That quote was actually never said by Marie Antoinette. It was later attributed to her by some critics living about a half century later. But in reality, the actual government of France at this time, of course, no government can be perfect, but it did have balanced checks. It was balanced with checks and balances, and the king was not absolute at all. He was actually governed by church law, constitution, customs, and checked by the aristocracy.
Yeah, interesting that. Alan, French monarchy in and of itself is really a huge, huge topic. And it really is kind of the cornerstone and really the example that really Catholic monarchy should follow. And I know you're very, very passionate about this. I know that you just want to be king. You want to be the one who rules everything.
Yeah, something like that. It's in order to see how important this is and how crazy the radicals at this time were. It's important to remember the very strong cohesion between the French monarch and the very strong unity behind him that dates all the way back from the 100 Years' War. If you weren't fighting under the monarch's banner during the 100 Years' War, while it was under siege during that long conflict, you were completely against the monarch and against France. There were no other allies. You were either with the King of France or you were his direct enemy. It didn't matter how many fleur-de-lis you had on your banner. You were with the English and you were against France if you weren't with the king. He had nobody else on his side at this time. Now the Maid of Orleans comes along, Joan of Arc. She had a different banner, but she submits to the king and convinces him to go get crowned, and she obeys him afterwards, and even to her detriment. But this inseparable link is especially true following the work of Joan of Arc to save France and King Charles VII getting crowned due to her. So from the get-go, from the rebirth of France at the 100 Years' War, to be French, you had to be under and loyal completely to the king. And that was the deciding factor. Nothing else was. Later on this account, the French king was able to amass enormous prestige with continued loyalty unabated from his subjects to the point of massive government bloating and centralization, all to the detriment of the kingdom. But the people, though, understood their obligation of submission to him, even in a spiritual sense, as he had to answer directly to God. And he was also restrained by the church, which they trusted. And that is why this assault on monarchy was so anti-French. It was an utter attack on the spiritual understanding of the world and the hierarchy of things. And naturally, it would only lead to complete rupture with the previous order. So don't you see, by attacking the king, the revolutionaries were impaling France and turning literally everything upside down. Nothing on this level, Jack, it had been tried so drastically in the Western world to break continuity with the past in at least a couple thousand years, if ever before.
Yeah, let's talk about those revolutionaries a bit here. So the story goes that these revolutionaries were hungry, they were angry, and they were looking for someone to blame. And they said, oh, the king's in charge, so he's at fault. So we're all going to come together as a loose ragtag team of peasants and just nobodies, and we're going to go to Paris, and we're going to change things. Is that true, Alan?
Well, I don't think it's quite that simple. That's why we're having a full episode on this. The actual motivators behind this had much more of a problem than just filling their stomachs at the time. Many of them had very strong motivations. But let's take a step back just for a second, to understand how the French monarchy, how it functioned. There was an actual spiritual element to this too. It's not just a political, we need bread, we're going to turn on the king until we find bread. There was a very strong spiritual element in this as well. We're going to get more into the antagonists in just a second here, but to focus back on the victim here, which is the French monarchy, it has such a rich history and continuity with the West that, even though there's a slump in monarch quality following the Reformation, it still has this enormous prestige behind it. And there's these spiritual and physical roles, which, I mean, you know some about too, Jack. But there's a lot of like monarchical powers that are brushed aside by modern historians, especially by concerted efforts by historians following the Revolution, especially in the 19th century. There's actually very much written evidence that the kings of England and France, who were actually tied by blood, had the spiritual power to cure scrofula, which is actually called the king's touch. But there's other things like the Holy Roman Emperor had the power to control the weather if it was going to be used for God's glory. Like these like really outlandish things.
Right. It does sound outlandish, but there is a similar amount of evidence attesting to these things, as many events understood as truth without a fact.
It's very sadly underemphasized the how there was such a link. Today it's all about, separation of church and state, separation of church and state. I mean, sure, there's some benefits, but we didn't need to divorce them. They need to be properly reconciled because faith ought to govern the secular sphere. And actually, the monarchical role was even liturgical. There was functions that the king had in liturgy, and he was crowned by the Archbishop of Reims, and that in the historic cathedral there. And that line dates back to at least the 900s and lasted for a solid 800 years of kings getting crowned by the Archbishop. They're in a way, the political realm has been abandoned by the spiritual realm in a way, or it has abandoned the spiritual realm. And it sounds crazy, but make no mistake, good kings, there were obviously bad kings, but good kings took into account the spiritual roles that they had. This wasn't just a political organism. The French monarchy and all Catholic governments of medieval Europe, they all had a very spiritual tie, and they were looking out for the spiritual good of their people as well as the material good of their people.
Right. So the state of the church at this time, at the eve of the French Revolution, there were some motivators that came into play, but the state of the church at the time was everything was very comfy. Everything was very nice and cozy and warm. The only recognized religion of the state at that time, of the kingdom, I should say, is Catholicism. That's it. Nothing else is recognized. That's really the only true religion that they see fit. And the majority of the country, if not all, were Catholic. And there are a ton of monasteries. The clergy were plentiful, and everything was really going right at the time. However, there was complacencies at that time. You could see that both in the monarchy and with the people as well. But in that comfort, there was seemingly a little bit of a crack forming. Those who were not in favor of the monarchy, those who were really enemies of it, those kind of free thinkers, those who wanted to govern themselves, soon they looked towards the past at like the French Reformation. We kind of got to see some cracks. At one point, those like the Protestants and the Huguenots really had a foothold in France. Later, they were kind of drove underground and didn't make any progress. But still, that kind of showing up of Protestantism in France, of all places, really got to show that France could crack, even just a little bit.
There were definitely already getting to be some issues. Now, they were mostly resolved before the Revolution, but France had some bitter civil wars, actually, just less than 200 years before the French Revolution, and that's between Protestants making inroads into Catholicism and Catholics there. And it was mainly politically oriented because Catholicism was so ingrained in France that in order for the Protestants to gain, they had to politically overturn Catholicism, and that was creating a disruption in the fabric of society. They had to kind of oust Catholicism to open up a more freedom of religion, which caused tension. It spilled over into the political realm. You actually had Huguenot, like Calvinist city-states in France fighting wars against the king. It was a mess, but France made it through, but there was a little bit of a shaky foundation there. And part of that, too, is there was an inroad, and French universities were very famous, which allowed some of this to come in. Some of this came in through the university system, and France soon became the breeding ground for the Enlightenment.
And that kind of brings us into our third player. We had the Protestants, we had the Huguenots.
The Huguenots were Protestants, don't get us wrong, but they versus the regular Protestant reformers, the Huguenots took a very militaristic and devastating approach to France. But anyways, continue on.
Right. And the Huguenots, too, they were kind of known as kind of the armed wing. Their kind of roles in society at that time where they were really mercenaries. And that was kind of a big scare at the time in France, but I digress. Our third real big player here is Freemasons. Now, Freemasonry has a long, long history, but the long of short of it for now is that there are a lot of lodges, Freemason lodges in France. At the time of the eve of the revolution, there was about 600 lodges, and even more. And they were encompassed in more than 250 cities and surrounding towns in France. And even kind of the lowest estimates of enrollment in these lodges was like 35,000 people. That's a large amount of people.
That's very large, especially in contrast to the declining mass numbers that were seen over the course of the middle and late 18th century as the church got kind of slumbersome in France. Everything looked all right. The Reformation had kind of been dealt with. Sure, there was the Enlightenment, but we're safe here. The French monarchy is strong. We've got, however, this had a very detrimental effect on the church, as we kind of already discussed. But mass numbers were in decline, and lodges were filling up and starting all across France, and this was going to have a devastating impact.
Right, and lodges were a big breeding ground for promoting Enlightenment ideas.
Yeah, and it was mainly their large promotion of secular governance, that was the biggest blow to Western civilization at that moment, and it was all the more lethal when in regard to the church's eldest daughter here, which, Freemasonry at the time it's very new. It was kind of just a really groundbreaking social club in a way for many people. It was where very many smart people hung out and bounced ideas off of each other, but it was also the playground of the radicals. It had, according to the traditional date, 1717 is when the Freemasons took form, which, interestingly enough, to some of you who really study history, that is directly between the 1517 revolt against the church launched by the reformers in the Protestant Reformation, and in 1917 between the communist upheaval starting in Russia, which is an interesting thing to note for any of you into dates. But regardless, the Freemasonry isn't viewed. The church is starting to become wary of it. I think the popes have condemned it by this point, but leading key French figures are Freemasons.
Yes, and we can even speculate that Napoleon, we don't know for sure if he was a Freemason, but later into the Revolution and even into the Napoleonic era, we can pretty for certain say that most of his family was. And there are many other figures like Lafayette was, Marat Robespierre.
The Duke of Orleans was Garat and Marat and Danton and Desmoulins, all these big names for the scholars out there. The vast majority of the key moving figures in the revolution, they're all directly tied to a lodge.
So we're at the point where they're starting to show some cracks. We have some weak monarchs leading up to Louis XVI. We have lowering mass attendance and an increase in lodge membership and attendance as well. And this is the breeding ground for anti-monarchy, and soon people are going to want to do something about it.
A political crisis is going to be the way in, and they've been talking about this in the lodges for some time, actually. German and French Masonic lodges were the breeding ground for most of the ideas that would be put into place, and the revolution and the proposed new government structures, they were all actually plotted out in the lodges of France and some in Germany, mainly in the 1770s and 1780s, in the generation leading up to the revolution. So make no mistake, this was orchestrated off the bat. A famous researcher into secret societies who he went by the name of Webster in his works, concluded in one of his works that the French Revolution was not spontaneous, but it was really an organized, planned upheaval, basically to overthrow the monarchy, undo the hold of Catholicism, and undo France as everybody knew it.
Yeah. And I like how you said organized, planned, upheaved. That's a really good descriptor of what I believe happened at the Bastille. Now, the common narrative is that the Bastille was a time when the angry mob came and they just attacked and were able to overpower everybody. Just a random angry mob wanted to attack a prison. Well, what if a group of organizers saw the Bastille? They saw it had a governor, it had a very small detachment of soldiers, and they had, because of those soldiers, they had arms and munitions. Why not try out this kind of organized mob? Why can't you just try them out a little bit, get them a little bit of battle tested, and have them attack, and then they can, one, see how well and effective they are at capturing and killing people, and at the same time getting arms and munitions and going forth.
It came together much too quickly to be completely spontaneous. I mean, let's just think about it rationally too. Why would a mob spontaneously organize and then just assault one of the most well-defended and prominent buildings in Paris out of the blue? Like they don't even go right for the king. They don't go for anyone. They don't go for food. They just attack this big prison. It seems rather pointless. But
right, and at that time, it was a prison, and not many people were even being imprisoned there at the time.
Yeah, well, but I don't remember the exact number, but it's very clear they were directed. This was a very planned. This is a chessboard. You know, the radicals are starting to take over the pieces, and they are moving slowly. And this is a symbolic throw. This is a moving your knight right to the middle of the board right here. This is grabbing the direct attention of the monarchy, of the church. This is saying, hey, listen up. We want to change some things. You better listen to us. Why else would you assault in France, like in Paris, one of the most well-known institutions or one of the most well-known structures completely identified with the monarchy and the executive?
Right, and don't get the picture that this kind of mob was just peasants with farm tools. It is well documented that German mercenaries were present there. And mercenaries don't do anything for the kindness of their heart. They're paid for. I mean, these guys are going out there saying, hey, give us money. We will do whatever you want. We got the power of the gun behind us. Send us your way. Just give us a paycheck at the end of the day.
But Jack, I thought it was just like regular peasants that were revolting. They wouldn't have had that money because they needed to go buy food.
Well, I don't know, Alan. I don't know.
That's why, where is the money coming from behind all of these lodges springing up out of nowhere? There's clearly some wealth in this, and I have good reason to suggest that the Freemasons paid a great many of the rebels and these mercenaries at the storming of the Bastille and later put them into use. It's interesting. A very noted Freemason, Dr. David Harrison, he claims that Freemasons were behind, or at least very involved, in every revolution in the West in the century between 1750 and 1815. We're looking right in the middle of that. The Freemasons had a very revolutionary mindset at this time, and they had they now had the power to do it. And this is one of the first instances where you really see that.
Right. And you're probably wondering if, when you say Freemasons, this is kind of a not really loose group, but this is a group of people with these ideals. And you're probably wondering, where is all this money coming from? Well, the majority of these memberships are from the Third Estate. And when you hear that, you think, oh, peasants, you think farmers. Well, the Third Estate isn't really poverty. The Third Estate is anybody that just doesn't meet those first two criteria of the First and Second Estate. So think of it like the middle class. There's rich middle class and there's kind of lower middle class. So there is money to go around at this time. But still, that kind of question of, well, how did they get this money? How did that come about? Well, that might have a little bit to play with that.
Yeah, it's very interesting too. Yeah, the misconception there. There were very many wealthy men that were in the Third Estate simply because they did not own ancient mansions and manors that qualified them for actual titles of nobility and certain other things. They didn't have enough ties to the throne or what have you. But there were certainly no lack of power in the third estate, as we see. And true, and many of these really wealthy Freemasons and stuff, there are very few of the members of the revolution came from outside the third estate.
Think of it like the American Revolution at the time. You had like learned men, like lawyers, like Jefferson. You had like men like Adams. So like these revolutionaries aren't really just poor people.
You bring up Jefferson and the American Revolution, which is a very interesting topic, and many people have started to draw some parallels and conclusions and stuff. There aren't a whole lot of solid conclusions that we want to talk about today. Maybe we'll get into that, but there's a very interesting tie between the French Revolution and the American Revolution, and the topic of Freemasons at the time being involved in these very, very many important figures in the American Revolution too were wealthy Freemasons. Jefferson comes to mind. I mean, very wealthy, very famous Freemason, and you saw his very anti-Catholic, anti-traditional stances. I mean, when he creates his own New Testament, which wipes the divinity of Christ out of the Bible. I mean, some of these very provocative anti-Christian acts, which they spill across the channel over here to the American side of the world. But
yeah, and I think too that Americanism in and of itself is a huge topic, and there was a ton of Freemasonry in the founding of America, and I think that really expanded way into the embodiment of really soul the country at the time, and I think that deserves its own episode.
Yeah, we'll have to circle back into that because there's some strong ties between the early Americanist movement, which it continues down to this day, but very, very close ties to what we've been talking about here today. But yeah, we'll get into that in some future episode. But before we move on from the Freemasonry segment here, it's important just to know, if you don't believe us that the Freemasons were a big part of this, you merely need to start doing some Google searches, and many of the flags of the revolution had Masonic imagery. The cult of reason, which and all the godless style of architecture that they started to try to promote, all of this, it had that hallmarks of kind of a new agey sort of Freemasonry ideal, and the worship of, or not the worship, the honor and the intrigue with pre-Christian civilization and styles of government and all of this stuff. It was basically a giant rejection of the medieval Catholic worldview.
Right. Instead of like authority and respecting God, it was more of like the intrinsic values that come from being human, like gaining intelligence and being able to reason. These kind of ideas were really impregnated into the really try to replace Catholicism. You had the cult of reason that came about, and really all that was, man, we're very learned, we can reason, and we got to worship that fact that we are so amazing that we can do that. Something is intrinsic with all these groups is that they believe in something higher, that there is something worship-worthy, but they really can't really pin it down.
They end up falling into a pride in just replacing worship of the divinity with the worship of human nature, which we see in just the cult of reason taking center place right in the Cathedral of Paris, also in many cathedrals around France. But you had the worship of, or the cult of the supreme being, and the cult of the goddess of reason. Both of these very human-focused, human element that they basically tried to insert in place of Christ.
Yeah, didn't they have some guy's wife kind of like in the middle of the church? And they were like dancing around her in like white linens, or
there were some very strange paganish style cults that occurred at that time. We won't get into full detail of that, but yeah, the goddess of reason was, and the cult surrounding it had a lot of erroneous beliefs, and they were a little bit into promiscuity, a little bit, a little bit, and that's just another testament to when you throw off the yoke of Christ and replace it with a yoke of human origin, you're going to end up with the vices that our human nature bring with it.
And they promoted more secular governance. And this was really to blow against Western civilization.
In short, the enemies of the church are going to hijack the revolution, and using some bad social conditions, they're going to overthrow the social order. And anywhere the Freemasons got involved, I mean, in Europe and Catholicism, you saw war. And so they're nearly successful here in France. But, I mean, and regardless of specifics, later on, though the Masons may not have been united, they did play a very active role in unseating the established order. So we'll move on now.
Yeah. So how could have this been avoided? I mean, could they have suppressed the Freemasons? Could they have opened up the granaries? Could they cut the taxes? What really was at stake that could really stop this?
That's an interesting thing. It's kind of reduced to speculation at this point. We don't know how bad the famine was in 1788, right before the revolution broke out. We don't know. Louis XVI, though, contrary to being a tyrant, he calls the Estates General, which hasn't met for hundreds of years, and he wants to discuss with them a solution, kind of calling a council, but what happens is it gets hijacked by the radicals. They see this attempt to fix things, or like an attempt to mend the solution or mend the situation and propose a solution, as just a mere means to get what they want accomplished. And we're gonna see that spill across. The king has good efforts here. He has good intentions, but they can't. By the time the Estates General meets, they lose the power to actually do anything. So had they maintained the power enough to do things, I'm sure there was things they could have done. Obviously cut back on the lavish spending of the French court at the time, which was already getting reeled back in a little bit. But
now, Alan, one of the big things when we were kind of researching this, you were talking about the consecration to the Sacred Heart. And I think this is huge. And this is very, very critical to kind of the precursor to what led up to the French Revolution. Some may say this is even a trial. This is kind of a test. And I think you really enlightened me on this. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was doing some research for this episode, and I was looking into the history of France a little bit, and I came across an interesting spiritual dimension to this that is rarely talked about. I think surprisingly few people know about it. But way back, exactly a century before the French Revolution breaks out, Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque, a French nun at the time, she has a series of writings, and in some of these, she has some very interesting things to say about France, the nation, and its political future. And in 1689, she wrote, "It is by this divine heart," which she is referencing consecration to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. She says, "It is by this divine heart that God wishes to dispense the treasures of his graces of sanctification and salvation, by bestowing his benediction on all the king's undertakings, according a happy success to his arms, and making him triumph over the malice of his enemies." And she wrote that the Lord wishes the Sacred Heart would reign in the king's palace, be painted on his standards, and engraven on his arms, in order to render him victorious over all his enemies. Now, this is very interesting. Some can draw some parallels to the future here, but we won't get to that just yet. But this is a very direct request, and Margaret Mary Alacoque goes right to Louis XIV, king at the time, very lavish spender, very worldly king, but Catholic, and he does have a slight understanding of his spiritual roles as King of France. She goes right to him, and she says, "The Lord wants you to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and the Lord will grant you success in your worldly endeavors to help build up the church on this accord, for the glory of the church and Christ over all the forces of Satan on earth." It's interesting to note, though, that sadly this was unsuccessful, and France since then has lost more battles in history and many, many wars. And I did see the stat, no country has lost more battles in the last 500 years than the Kingdom of France. And I think many of those possibly could have been avoided by this. But that side note aside, Louis XIV did not get around, or he kicked the can down the road a little bit too long, and he didn't ever consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. Louis XV never paid any attention to that. And Louis XVI, right before his death, promised to do it, but he was already imprisoned. And after he had made announcements that he would try to work with the bishops of France to consecrate the country to the Sacred Heart, he was hurriedly guillotined and had a very tragic fate thus. It's a very interesting topic, isn't it, to speculate on, Jack? We've got a very interesting thing kind of parallel to what you might see later with Fatima and Lucia and the papacy and Russia.
Yeah.
And Russia having this big revolution and would spread its errors throughout the world, but it was supposed to be consecrated to Our Lady.
It's like when you hear something like that, maybe you should listen. Maybe when you lose like every battle and every war that you've ever fought, maybe you should try something different, or maybe listen to a little bit of divine assistance.
Yeah, you might think this is very interesting, and if this is all true, it points to a grave flaw, and the kings of France were perhaps punished for their not working with the will of God for the greater glory of himself and the church. But I mean, we need not speculate anymore on that. We are not experts by any means, but it's a very interesting note worth considering. It was exactly 100 years between when Margaret Mary writes this and when the French Revolution breaks out, and the effects were tragic. And we have a very similar warning today that came from Mary at Fatima in 1917, ironically 200 years right after the Masons and 400 years after the Reformation breaks out. And that is asking for the consecration of Russia. And that is right before the catastrophic Soviet revolution breaks out and communism starts to fill the world with its errors.
Ever since, there's been an age of revolutions all across the world. We're out of time for this episode, but there's plenty more that we want to talk about with the French Revolution.
You'll have to join us for our next episode, as we're going to finish this topic and add some more insight and a little bit of a look into the short-term, middle-term, and longer-term implications of the French Revolution on French society, the church, and the world.
Yeah, what was the secular government's response to the church? What did it try to do to them? Did they try to see if there was any loyalty behind them? And of course, what was the response from more God-fearing people? You'll have to learn more about that in the next episode of Two Trade School Trads.
We'll dive in. Until then, Ave Ave.
Christus Rex.
Rex Deus et Deus, Rex Deus Deus.